Hi, welcome everyone. We are recording this webinar today so that we can have this available later to families. Welcome to Texas Hands and Voices webinar series. We're just going to wait a minute or two just to see if we can get a few more folks to join us. If you're joining in now, we ask that you turn off your cameras and mute your video so that we can focus on our presenters and our interpreter if needed. And for those of you who are joining us today, we do have live captioning and an interpreter, an ASL interpreter available for you. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, this is, I'm Teresa Banda. Welcome to Texas Hands and Voices webinar. Today's webinar was titled The Importance of Language and Literacy Development, but we're going to call it something a little different today. Today's theme is actually real life language, supporting language and literacy this summer in the home. And with us today, we have Bill and Sarah Wainscott, and I will not do justice to their introduction, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but I do want to tell you a little bit about this duo. They are a super couple, amazing parents, and both have been lifetime members of Texas Hands and Voices. Sarah Wainscott is not only an amazing mom, but she also serves as vice president of our board. And Bill has been of course, an amazing dad, but also a longtime volunteer and supporter of Texas Hands and Voices. So welcome to both of you today, and we really appreciate you giving of your time and being part of our webinar series. And I'm just going to hand this over to you and allow you the opportunity to introduce yourself before we get started with today's webinar. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'm Sarah.
I'm Bill.
I'm going to go ahead and screen share so that you see our PowerPoint. And really, just like Teresa said, we're looking at providing some practical strategies, mostly as you guys get ready to enter that season of summer that you always think you're going to get so much done and never quite get accomplish what you'd like to accomplish. And our focus again is supporting language, and we know that dovetails right into literacy.
So I'll introduce myself. Obviously, Bill Wainscott. I'm a deaf ed teacher from RDSPD schools, regional schools here in Denton, as well as a certified interpreter.
Oh, and I'm Sarah, and my background's in audiology and deaf ed. Did early intervention for many years, and now I teach at Texas Women's University, where I train speech language pathologists and deaf educators, all about what to do with those young children who are deaf and hard of hearing.
And you see before you a picture of our family, and just a quick note about them. We have 5 kids, and 2 are deaf. One's John and one's Maggie, and they both have implants, but use Maggie's can use sign language, can use his implants very well, and talk like almost like a hard of hearing person. John is more dependent on signs.
Yeah, and we are very much a hands and voices family. So what works for your kid is what makes the choice right. Our kids have identical audiograms, the same family, and the same equipment, but they communicate in really different ways. And so as we think about how we leverage language in our home. Oh, yeah, you're right, Bill. I forgot this. Go.
Oh, right. So as we again, what works for us didn't always work for everybody else. So what you do what you want for your family. So we don't want putting guilt trip on you. So we say it's guilt-free. So we're saying guilt-free.
You can try that sign. Go ahead. If you don't have that sign, there it is. Right? Take it off. Take that weight off your shoulders. Right? But we would like to give you a plan, and that's our focus. So, one of the things about being teachers forever is that we got to practice on other people's kids before we had our own. And here's the reality, it's still really tough. And so just want to acknowledge that going in, that you have a hard job. But what we wanted to do today was look at several areas that really sabotage our kids in the classrooms, that also sabotage our kids at home. And my guess is that you have some of these same struggles with your kids. And so we want to think through access, how to make language accessible, working on vocabulary with your kids, helping them maintain a topic, and helping them organize their language with some structure. So for each of those 4 areas, we're going to talk about what will we target, what do we plan to do, what do we actually do, because it never works like you plan, and then give you some tools to try. So I really hope that it's a practical discussion, that you walk away with some additional items in your toolbox. So the first thing we want to talk about is access. And the question you need to be asking is the language in our family available to our children? So we have to start with consistent access. And my bent is auditory, Bill's is visual. So in terms of auditory access, we need to make sure that hearing technology is on consistently, that it's working. Just like, they're not going to access language if they can't see it. They're not going to access language if they can't hear it. And I want them to have the best access. I want to make sure that equipment's on. I'm also going to manage background noise. As hearing people, we are really good at listening in noise, even though there's lots going on around us, other conversations, music, the air conditioner, the neighbor's weed whacker, whatever. We can focus, but our kids who are hard of hearing and deaf really can't. So anything that I can do to manage that background noise is helpful. I'm also going to use some really deliberate strategies, and some of these are intuitive, some of them may not be. So the idea of pacing my speech, which I'm not doing well now, but making sure that I'm clear, that I pace it in a way that they have time to process it, because even for our kids who are really good language users, it takes just another second for them to process it. Slowing it down and pacing it is important. And you know this from a meeting that you've been to, it's really hard when people don't take turns. So trying to manage the turn taking helps that child tune in, and giving an extra second. So when that speaker changes, acknowledging that speaker so that they can turn their auditory and visual attention to that speaker. The other item listed there is acoustic highlighting, and you may do that without even realizing it, but it's that idea of, I'm going to emphasize key words to help make what I'm saying a little more accessible, right? So even as that kid's looking for that TV controller, right? The controller is under the blue blanket. So even as I'm going through, I'm highlighting some of those key words. I'm keeping it in a sentence, but I'm making those words a little bit more catchable.
And along with auditory access, we have visual access. And it's really, because sign language is a visual language. So we're signing what we can when we can. And not all of us are proficient signers, and that's okay. Just continue doing your best. So along with that visual access, be aware of the attention. So when you talk to a deaf hearing child, you get their attention first, with eye contact, and look at them to make sure that they can see you. And some strategies with that we don't even think about at times is often if we're in the kitchen or in the room, our backs are turned, so you're facing them. If our child is obviously small, we're tall like me, I'll bend down, look at them, and give them good eye contact, and facial contact. And we can watch out the lighting. Obviously, you can't really see in the dark, and so signs are hard to sign. And watch out, make sure the lighting is turned on and is bright enough. And also, like often we find ourselves around the dinner table, and make sure we're sharing and taking turns and make sure who's talking, so everybody knows whose turn it is.
And the reality is access varies, right? So we plan all of those things, but we still struggle most days.
Right. So our home with the 5 kids, several dogs, is loud and busy. Now that's also fun. We have fun times, great times together as a family, but it doesn't always provide communication access clearly for everyone. So we don't always sign as parents. Even myself, I'll put my hands down at times and forget. So that's something we struggle with, and also because it's so busy, we just tend to forget. We also have lots of visitors. Our kids' friends, our friends, that come over and don't really understand like deaf culture, and how we do things here, and so they're just talking to them directly without any sign support. And we spend a lot of time out, really national parks, restaurants, just walk in the park, and we come across things that we're not always paying attention to what we're doing.
There are some things we do well. And so like one of the things is hearing technology is a given. My kid may forget to brush his teeth, but he's not going to forget his implant, right? That's a given. So that's great. All of our kids may not be fluent, but they have solid sign skills. And so when communication breaks down, they do pick up their hands. And so that is a priority, to build those skills. We are intentional about things like TV and technology, because it's really hard to focus on communication when that television's on. And so when we watch TV, we watch it together, but we have it off, and we try to get those kids off the phone the other times too. We're really intentional about positioning. So even as we, have a family gathering with extended family or decide where to sit around the table, like my mom was I don't know what her thing was with centerpieces. We can't have a centerpiece because you can't see the people. That idea, we're going to be intentional always about how we position. And then, like Bill said, there's so many times that we don't do it well, but we've really said as a family, dinner time, right? And so even if we screw up the whole rest of the day, my kids know that when we get to dinner time, we're going to be so intentional about communication. Everybody's going to be together. We're going to take turns. And that's a predictable time where my kid knows he's going to be included.
So I'll to give you more tips for access, some tools, sign language apps. There's a ton of sign language apps out there, and access on your phones, Android phones, for if it's C, sign exact English, or ASL. Some are free and some cost, depending on what you're paying for. Also, there's a great program through a statewide outreach center, and they're called Family Signs Program, and offers a person to teach you sign language or your family sign language on your own computer, your own home, at your time. You just have to go on and register. And these are all links that you can click on later. Also, Text to Hands and Voices provides a guide by your side. This is a deaf, hard of hearing adult who's already has the experience that help train your child, kind of navigate the waters and stuff, and different teaching sign language, and to get you through some life with a deaf and hard of hearing child.
Yeah, a little clarification on that, because the guides, we do have a parent-to-parent guide, which would be hearing, but like Bill said, there's that deaf or hard of hearing guides, because a lot of our families have never met another individual who's deaf or hard of hearing. And some of those guides may use sign language. Some of them are great coaches in terms of those auditory skills because they have lived experience as a hard of hearing person. In terms of auditory access, the Ling sound check, if you've never heard about it and your kid has technology, somebody should have told you, but it's a real quick and easy test that we do in the schools, and that your audiologist should have taught you. So there's a link, you could Google it, the Ling sound check. That's how you check your kid's equipment. Sound level meter app, I know that sounds really nerdy, but here's the deal. We don't have a sense of how loud it gets in our environment. And sometimes that's a really quick check. And so, when I'm out and about and my kid's behavior gets off and I open up that sound level meter and I see, hey, the background noise here is about 70 decibels. No wonder he cannot follow directions. It's just too loud. So yeah, I think it's just a quick check. I use it more often than I should because it is kind of nerdy. Bill doesn't let me pull it out in church anymore. Manufacturers' websites, your kid's hearing aid was made by somebody, just like your car was made by Chevy or Ford or whoever. And a lot of times you can go to that manufacturer's website and learn a ton about your kid's equipment. And so, know who your manufacturer is, and there's, lots of them have videos and tools. The other thing is hearing loss simulation. We use these with students that I teach. We use those with teachers. So you might show it to a mainstream teacher. But especially when my daughter communicates so effectively, it's easy to miss how hard she's working. And so whether it's sharing that simulation with her basketball coach or her cousin, helping somebody else understand what it might be like to listen through a hearing aid can be really effective. So the next thing we wanted to talk about was vocabulary. And the question you need to be asking is, does your child have the words or signs that they need to communicate effectively? And certainly vocabulary weaknesses are something that we see in our students. And that comes across in their social vocabulary as well as their academic vocabulary. Now, my guess is that your mom did not teach you vocabulary sitting on a couch with flashcards. You learned vocabulary by sort of absorbing it in your environment. And some of our deaf kids do, but most of them honestly do not. We call that incidental language learning, absorbing the language that's in the environment. But when you have hearing aids on and you have trouble hearing in noise and your microphone only picks up what's right around you, you don't learn that vocabulary from those extraneous conversations like our hearing kids do. And likewise for our signing kids, if they're not looking, they miss it. And there simply are fewer people that are signing in their environment. So picking up vocabulary is more difficult, which means that, that it's really important for our families to be intentional about building vocabulary. And so what vocabulary are we talking about? Well, sometimes our families are great at just labeling things, but that's not the same as giving them a rich vocabulary. So for example, names of people and places and activities. So I know that we encounter a lot of kids that can't tell you who the people are in their family or what the relationships are, or name the places that they go. And so that really limits what they're able to communicate about. I'm thinking about broad varieties of descriptors. And so we might use the words big and little or the signs big and little. But the reality is in print, we would see lots of words like huge and enormous and gigantic. And if they're not exposed to those words, they don't learn them. And so thinking about using broader descriptors, words for time and place and location, those prepositions, and it seems like a grammar lesson, but the reality is, again, if we're not exposed to them, we don't pick them up. And so it takes a little extra intention to do that. A lot of times we teach them labels, but we don't teach them categories. So for example, they might know school and church and house, but they might not know the word building. Or we might teach them a function, but not the item. So I remember discovering that my child knew the word cook, but he didn't know the word oven. And how did I miss teaching him that? And so that's tricky. And the reality is sometimes we kind of dumb it down to keep things efficient. And so I remember taking a walk with my kid and I pointed to that little flower and I said to my hearing kid, that's a crocus. That's grandma's favorite flower. And to my deaf kid, I said, look, it's a little purple flower. Well, I didn't give them the same vocabulary model. It's not wrong to identify that as a purple flower, but I need to think about giving them the other labels as well. And then personal safety items. I know this is uncomfortable to talk about, but the reality is our kids that are deaf and hard of hearing are more vulnerable to abuse and neglect, and being able to talk about that has a protective feature, and we recognize that. And so being able to, again, identify who's there in their environment, where they go is important. But also words like no and help, helping describe whether or not you're comfortable or uncomfortable, and even naming some body parts. And so one resource is the Our Children's Project. If you're not familiar with that, they have lots of resources if those are things that I'm not sure how to talk to my kid about that vocabulary. And then there's academic vocabulary. And so
Being a teacher, a lot of the vocabulary we teach in schools that are the hearing students would probably come with and understand the prior knowledge, but our deaf kids, many of them are lacking that vocabulary in science and social studies. And, think about like in history, words like rebellion or Confederacy or even battle or fort. Things that they may not even recognize and put those words together or understand the words. So having those words even discussed at home is very helpful to us as teachers. And often you can go onto the websites and go on to whatever grade your child's in, and like some words. Now I teach middle school, so I look at like 7th grade words, or there'll be on the STAR test, or but you find words are important from that age level. And there's age appropriate terms for comparisons and measurements, using the cup, or as Sarah said earlier, like big or little, or how much to measure.
Yeah, and I think when we think about comparisons and measurements, we're thinking, what does that have to do with things like math? But the reality is our kids that are deaf and hard of hearing, they have difficulties in math, not necessarily because of the computation piece, but because of the language piece. And so much of that math is which is more than, which is less than, which is enough, those measurements. And, the place that we work on that at home, frankly, a lot of times is the kitchen. That's a real natural opportunity, or even a fix-up project or a craft, using some of those comparison language. I was going to give one more example. We talk about, vocabulary, and the other thing is just to tune into mistakes that your child makes and being able to capture those. And so the other day, our senior in high school was heading off, and it was the frog lab day where they dissect a frog. And she was talking about it being digestion day. And we said, wait, Maggie, you're not going to eat the frog, right? It's not digestion day, it's dissection day. But you realize how quickly and easily they can make those errors. And rather than just letting it go, it's that deliberate process of intervening and saying, wait, you missed that. Let me help you. And then curriculum specific terms, like Bill already mentioned. And when we do that in a couple of ways, one is through interactions and the other is through experiences. And so there are times that we intentionally model target vocabulary. And so, for example, when we are planting a garden, we might talk about things like seeds and roots and irrigation and all of those kinds of things. And we're going to use it multiple times, and we're going to use it in multiple situations so that they get more real experience with it. I'm also going to want to coach them to use that vocabulary themselves, because they don't really own it unless they use it. And then there's that idea again of maintaining high expectations. And so I'm going to use that word irrigation and sprinkler and damp and moist and wet, because I don't want them just to have wet and dry and water. I want them to have a richer vocabulary, and I have to expose them to that. Right. And, Bill will speak to this. There's not a sign for everything. And what does that mean? How do you expose them to that vocabulary?
The experiences,
And
finger spelling.
And finger spelling. I gave you the prompt. Finger spelling. Finger spelling is how you do it. And then that idea of experiences. And so even as we go through experiences, we're big campers. And so that idea, we're going to plan together. And we're going to use language. We're going to do the camping together. We're going to use language. And then we're going to take lots of pictures and talk about it afterwards and use the language. I do that in preschool. I do that when I teach graduate school. And I do it with my own kids. That plan, do, review helps you hold on to the concepts. And in our case, hold on to the language.
And one story to add to that, a student some years ago, every time they come back from a vacation or a break from school, I always ask them what they did, and just a good writing story and a good prompt for them. And there's one student shared he was in a boat and a lake and some water, boat and water. I kept pulling, prompting, questioning, figure out what was where was it at. He couldn't tell me. What kind of boat was it? Big? He said it's a little big. So we finally ended up kind of calling his mom just to kind of help clarify some things. And
he's a middle schooler.
Oh,
just to give you a sense of, he's a middle schooler.
And found out he was on a cruise in the ocean. So it wasn't just a boat in a lake. So again, he had a great experience, but he couldn't have the labels, the understanding behind it.
Yeah. So the encouragement is it's great to take your kids fun places and do amazing things. It's even greater if you can put the language on top of it. And one of the ways is that you do that is by talking about doing what you're doing, sort of narrating. And we talk about sort of being that news commentator, like as you're going through the activity. And it seems a little weird, but the reality is that's a great way to build language. We know that narrating what that child does is really helpful in terms of putting language on top of what they do. And then reading and pay attention to the books your child chooses. And it may surprise you to know that our hard of hearing and deaf children will often gravitate to nonfiction instead of fiction. And the reason is when you're reading fiction, there's characters and what did they mean and what was their motivation and how did it happen? What was the sequence? That's a lot of language. It's really tricky to navigate. And sometimes reading a book about volcanoes is just a lot more straightforward because there's facts. And so both of those provide great language experiences, but keep an eye out. And as you think about, coaching that child about which books to pick, can you pick examples of both kinds of books?
So in the moment, what we're doing with that, and again, we are not perfect parents, and we try our best with our 5 grown kids now. And this is what we struggle with most days. As we plan. We're not always good planners. We should be better planners for what we should do. And because there's so many things happening within our lives, our kids' basketball tournaments, our outdoor experiences. We'd always plan for all these things for language to happen. And we have a variety of language kids in our house. As far as and how do you make sure all the kids feel have access to that language? This kid needs a little more explanation. This and the kid's fine, and to really to be able to teach and parent them in a way that they all feel understood.
And sometimes we have to pick: am I going to teach vocabulary here, or am I going to communicate the concept efficiently? Because I'm really trying to get dinner on the table. And so you do both things.
And when there's more pleasure reading, we do less reading during the school year as we should. And as you said before, reading is important, and kids gravitate to other things, especially their phones. Then we can pick up a good book.
Yeah, we're a lot more likely to have a family movie night than we are family reading night, honestly. But we do some things well. And so Bill and I are a good tag team. And so when the communication breaks down, one of us will catch it. And we may support the language in different ways, which is probably a good model. We are pretty good at seeing that breakdown and seizing the opportunity. And so, the first time we were talking about this, we had been at Family Weekend Retreat. My daughter was trying Pepsi. She's not a Pepsi drinker. And my husband said, well, just take a sip of it. And she said, a sip. And she hadn't been exposed to that word. And so he fingerspelled it, sip. He explained it's like tasting a little bit. It's just a sip. He gave her a sign. He fingerspelled it. He modeled it. And so it's that idea of I'm not just going to say, just drink a little, but I'm going to stop in that moment and give you that vocabulary word so that she doesn't go around saying that she's digesting frog. We have a lot of language experiences, and we're 2 teachers. We've always done it on the cheap. So you don't have to take the cruise to the ocean. You could take a walk on the nature trail at the park across the street, and there's still ample opportunities for language. Some tools for vocabulary, especially our deaf and hard of hearing kids. Reading is harder for them than it is for most of our hearing kids. And so motivation is an issue. And I would love to say we join that library reading, club every summer, but we sign up, Bill signs up, and we never follow through. One of the things that's been successful in school and at home is magazines. Great kids magazines like Sports Illustrated for kids or National Geographic for kids. Lots of really cool visuals, really weird animals, the sports heroes that they like. The text is in these colorful text boxes, and there's not a ton of it, and they can navigate it easily, and it feels cool to get a magazine. So yeah, I'm pro kids magazine. And
at middle school level, very popular type of books is graphic novels. They look more like comic books, but they're in a novel form. And the kids, deaf and hearing kids, often gravitate to those because they're fun to read. Again, encourages reading, and they see it as a nice thing to do.
Right. So she's not going to read Jane Austen, but she will read Sports Illustrated. Rosetta Stone, and we used that when when we are trying to learn another language. But often we'll use Rosetta Stone because it's this lovely computer-generated program for teaching vocabulary, and that's a great way to learn English vocabulary, and it feels gamish, and it's a real strategic approach. The Texas TEKS, Bill mentioned, what is the academic vocabulary? Is there a way that I could give my kid a head start this summer by exposing him to some of that? What is the vocabulary? Go to the Texas TEKS site that, you can look up, third grade social studies, and it'll tell you what the vocabulary targets will be. Reading Rockets is a great website, tons of things related to reading, and they have a specific area that are literacy apps, all kinds of apps that you could use to support literacy. Load some of those up on an iPad. That can be a great tool for you. One of the things that we've done is experience books, and so it's not as fancy as it sounds. I load them into a Google folder and send them off to Shutterfly, and they come back in a book form. But even for our child who's not as competent in terms of language, when an extended family member comes over and he wants to talk about his trip, he's able to pull out that experience book and walk through it and look at these cool pictures. And so again, that idea of I'm going to plan it, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to review it. It's a great way to go back and talk about that language again. The other thing we were going to talk about is topics. Is your child able to have a conversation that's on topic? This is a consistent challenge for us with kids in classrooms and within our home too. And so these are our targets. We want, a conversation is a coordinated effort. And then there's an initiator and a responder. There's a back and forth, and our kids are not great at that. Excuse me. So in terms of initiation, we want them to be able to select a variety of topics that are interesting and that are appropriate. Sometimes we'll go in and the kid has a great conversation. You see him in the classroom and he had this great conversation about Minecraft, and you go in the next day and he's talking about Minecraft. You go in a week later, he's still talking about Minecraft. And the reality is he's not very flexible. He's not able to talk about lots of different appropriate targets. And so that's one of the things that we're coaching on. Our kids that are deaf and hard of hearing are not very good at what we call theory of mind. What does that mean? That means the ability to take somebody else's perspective. And one of the ways that we see that is that your kid will start giving, especially a stranger or somebody that has not experienced the event with you, a story, but they won't give them the background information that they need. They'll just sort of jump in the middle of the story because they're not able to stop and think about what that individual perceives, right? And so we want that child to be able to provide background information. Some of it is as simple as, are you entering a conversation in an appropriate way and in an appropriate timing? And is your story logical? Does it make sense? Or do I have to sort of tease together the pieces because you didn't have it in a logical order?
And other times is our child responding correctly? I'm sure, I don't know if you've all experienced this with your children. The deaf nod, they think they understand. We would think they understand because they're nodding correctly. I get that all the time in school. The kid is nodding, and that's to check for understanding. No, it's not. We need to kind of get more from them than just the nod. Or the child's interrupting instead of just and jumping into a story, interrupting before I even finish my sentence. or my question, and also our child is making just random comments, really so off topic. Be careful about with your child how they respond to make sure we're coaching them correctly.
And so what's our plan? Well, our plan is to help coordinate those conversations. And so we want to provide some supports, but we also want to provide some structures. And so one of the supports that we'll use is just a simple finger. And so, we're talking about, our plan to go learn pickleball, whatever it is. And our child comes in and he's trying to tell us about what the weather is in Japan. And we'll say, hold on, wait just a minute. Our topic here is learning a new game. And so the weather, what's happening in Japan, that's not on topic. We're back here. Do you have something related to this topic? And so that finger, they already know, hey, come back here. This is the topic. And then again, that's an example of modeling and coaching and giving feedback instead of just, again, modeling the behavior that you don't want. I'm going to nod like that. Weather in Japan's important right now when it really isn't. Let them know, wait, give them the feedback. That's not our topic. Going and setting clear conversational rules. I need to finish my sentence before you can start yours. Check for understanding. This is exactly what Bill said. It's not saying, did you understand that? It's asking, what did you hear her say? As a way to check for understanding. And what we really try to do is hold them accountable for clear communication. Not perfect conversation, not necessarily sign, not necessarily speech, but that your communication wasn't clear. And so that idea of telling them your communication broke down, helping them understand your communication wasn't clear. And what you have to say is really important. I want to know what you have to say. So if we're not giving them that feedback, we're not reinforcing the importance of their message. We also do things like pre-select topics. One example, like we said, was when we have dinner together, we do what we call highs and lows. And so every night, everybody knows we're going to go around the table and everybody's going to have their highs and their lows. Well, that helps my kid stay on topic, but it also helps him know what he can contribute. Or we may say we're going to have a family discussion and we're going to talk about our plan for our summer trip, or we're going to talk about grandma being sick, but letting them know ahead of time what the topics are. Sometimes our kid needs a prop, and so it's really hard for him to initiate a conversation. But he likes to run. He runs in lots of races. It's not uncommon for him to have a medal from a race in his back pocket so that he can pull it out and initiate a conversation. He needs that prop. Maggie doesn't need it. John needs a prop, and that's okay. Use a familiar format, again, making sure that they understand the rules and expectations. And then sometimes that's providing him a script. John, I know that you're excited to tell your Uncle Daniel about your race. You could say, Uncle Daniel, I want to tell you about my race. And so that seems really, John is in his 20s now. But the truth is that he, not all of my kids, but he still needs that structure.
So again, what we struggle with at home is being engaging and holding everybody accountable. Again, how to get all members of our family to have good, clear communication. We can't always target this one child's mistakes or parenting this communication. Make sure that communication is clear and understandable. And that's again, we just take a large family, and that's something we struggle with. I think, as I said, there's 7 of us, and supporting that conversation and managing all these little different tasks is very tricky.
Yeah, because sometimes we have to prioritize the engagement over the language, and I know that seems crass, but there are 3 other kids here, and I have to make sure that I'm responding to them as well. Most of the time, we have a handful of tools that we use consistently. So, for example, it's hard to keep those conversations that we dedicate at dinner on topic. And so we have a little box. They're called conversation cards. And when things go awry, we can pick out a communication card. Somehow that seems more neutral. Instead of mom saying, stop, we're going to talk about this. I pull out let's see what the card is. This is our topic. And somehow that's magical. So conversation cards, which I'm thinking we should dust off. We haven't used those in a while, maybe. Other than highs and lows, we mentioned that. That's part of our routine. And it's funny, we did that to sort of structure things for our deaf and hard of hearing kids. But when our kids' friends who are not deaf come to our house, and some of the deaf kids too, everybody says, are we going to do highs and lows? So it's a win for everybody. We do feel like we constantly referee and coach. And sometimes we feel like that's a success. And sometimes I feel like, are we ever going to get to the stage when we don't have to do that? We're not there yet. We are flexible with mode of communication. And so you can sign, you can talk, whatever you do works for all of us. But you have to communicate in a clear way. And if you want, there are times that the communication breaks down and somebody needs an interpreter or a facilitator. The rule that we have is you have to ask. So we are willing to help and facilitate, but part of what we're trying to coach is self-advocacy. And so if you need help, please ask. Some tools for those topics. We mentioned those table topics cards. There's a link. You can buy them yourself. Social Express app. A lot of our kids struggle with maintaining topics or those social skills. And some of these apps are developed for other populations. For example, kids with autism or kids with anxiety. But some of those same tools work great for our kids too. And the Social Express app is an example of that. Social stories. This is the idea of before we go and talk to Sixth Grandma, or before we go to extended family and have to navigate a conversation about your basketball game, can we practice it? And social stories are a way to practice storytelling before we get there. And so that's a great tool. Low-tech board games. That doesn't seem very exciting, but honestly, the kids love it. And especially the kids that kind of come in to our house. And so it's that idea of, hey, the script is already set up. I already know what I'm going to say when I play the game of life or sorry, or what, those things are already predictable. And so we have this natural turn taking built in. Uno, our daughter was getting ready for prom and the girls came over, and before going out, because you can't show up to prom on time, you have to show up late. They played Uno. So, the very things that we think are, oh my gosh, we're rearranging life, they kind of buy into. But it's predictable. Everybody takes turns. You know what you're going to say. So even our child who really struggles the most with language can come in as an equal there. Readers theater. We talked about picking books for your kids over this summer. Can you read it aloud? And I'm not saying read a novel aloud, but reading, Alexander's Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. That's a great way to practice vocabulary, but also that turn taking, or what does it sound like when you're frustrated or when you're excited? All of those things are great opportunities. Readers theater, again, reading the book aloud. Not as exotic as it sounds. Structure. And so this gets to some of that other storytelling that we talked about when we look at where language breaks down for our kids. And the question you can be asking yourself is, how well structured are my child's sentences and stories? And as we start to think about what we would call grammar, which seems pretty tedious and boring, what I would note for you that many times when we look at, as teachers, the language of our deaf and hard of hearing kids, it's their vocabulary that makes their language seem immature. But it's their poor syntax and grammar that makes their language seem disordered, right? Is how a speech language pathologist would describe it. So what we want to think about are, what are some ways that we can really come behind and support the development, not just of the vocabulary, but their language structure. And so one of the ways we want to do that is using conventional sentence forms. And so we want to do that by using full sentences. And so not just pointing and gesturing, using single words, using simple phrases, because it's easier for them to understand. I'm going to be intentional about making those sentences accessible, but I'm also going to use correct grammar. I'm going to think about high frequency grammar words. What are we talking about? Well, thinking about words that pop up in print all the time. And there's a list of these, actually. They're called Dolch words. But it's words like of and is and and the. They pop up a million times if you read text. But what are they? What is a the? What is an of? Because we can't see them, and they're sort of these fillers, but they show up all of the time in print. They're tricky. And so I'm going to walk through those with my kids. I want them to recognize them when they see them in print, but I also want them to know where they belong. Word endings. Our kids they often drop word endings. And what I want you to understand, child, is that when you drop the end of that word, when you don't put an S on the end, you've changed the meaning, because now I don't know if there were one or if there was more than one. That changes your meaning. So I'm going to want to try to review that. Many times our kids, their subjects and verbs don't agree, or their verb tenses don't agree. You can see that in their writing. And so those are things that I'd want to review. Articles and pronouns. Our own daughter, is proficient as she is in her language, still will struggle with correct pronouns. And so, it's not the high kids or the low kids. These things tend to be really prevalent in the language of our kids that are deaf and hard of hearing. And I want them to communicate effectively, but I also want them to be able to read and write well. So any supports that I can give in these areas, I want to leverage them, not just for oral communication, but also for print.
And what about the sign only kid? And so pick a system. Sign exact English, ASL, and sign. And they're looking at structure, conventional structure. Can they communicate clearly? And with any sign system, you're using finger spelling. How their finger spelling look? Is it clear and slow? You don't have to be fast, slow. Classifiers, things we think we describing things in our trips or at the park, what we're seeing out there. Are we describing those things and using the classifier, the hand shapes for those things? Or can the child tell us the location? And using those pronouns and sign.
And so it is going to look different for our sign-only kids, and you are going to have to look more intentionally at the print. But again, some of those markers like Bill described, what I'm looking for is, are they using a conventional structure? If my kid is using sign language that only me and my kid can understand, that's not a conventional structure. The idea of conventional is that this is a uniformly used language that lots of different people use. And that's going to make your kid a more effective communicator. It also tells us that he's following the rules of a specific language. And you really need to follow rules of language to communicate with other people, but also to develop a rule system in terms of your reading and writing. And that's really what we're trying to support. And so our plan is we're going to model complete sentences. And we've talked about that. Our plan is we're going to use what we call language expansion. And so when my child says more cheese, I'm going to say, oh, you want more cheese on your pizza. I'm going to take what he said, but I'm also going to expand it, and I'm going to put it into a nice sentence. And often I'll say, you want more cheese on your pizza. And I'll wait and I'll look at him, and often he'll come back with, yep, I want more cheese on my pizza, right? And that's the feedback loop. So I expanded him, I gave him that model, but then I hung out there for that uncomfortable moment to see if he can bring it back, and often he does. So that's a great strategy. Here's the deal. We just labeled a bunch of targets. We talked about prepositions. We talked about word endings. We talked about using, oh my gosh, that's a ton. And that's true. And you can't do it all. And so I would say pick your priority targets, right? And so right now for our daughter, verb tenses really sabotage her, and we see it in her writing. And so I'm much more likely to say, wait, when did that happen? And check the verb tense than I've given up on it. And so, you have to kind of pick your poison. I also want to, we've said this before, those receptive and those expressive skills play out in reading. and in writing. And so it's not a matter of I'm trying to be a spoken language bully, checking all, how you produce everything. I'm much less concerned about their speech than I am about their grammar, because that's going to play into their reading. And, the better readers they are, the better equipped they are for life. And then, whenever we say something, whether we sign it or we say it, it's gone. Once it's in the air, it disappears. But there's a permanency to print. And so that idea of writing something down, even something as simple as I said it, they didn't understand it. Let me write it down. Let's look at it. Because then it's in print and I can review it. Leveraging what we would call the permanency of print.
So again, content over construction. So again, what we struggle with is this. Sometimes there's too many targets in this one area, and the progress is slow. As Sarah said, you pick one thing to focus on, and we don't do a good job of that. We're just random picking things, and poor structure that sabotages our understanding.
So sometimes I want to help him, but I have no idea what he meant. Either because he didn't understand, didn't explain his topic, or his structure was so poor, and you have to go back and sort of interpret it in your head. What did he actually mean? And all of that takes an extra bit of time.
And just the weak connections to print. We tend to label things, but we don't always show them where it is, and have them write it down, or because it's so they can at least see it.
Yeah, I think we should require more writing of our kids than we do, just functional writing. Like, you make the list, you make the chart. And what we do well, we do provide strong models. We give them good feedback, and we are really willing to repeat what we say. We know, and hard of hearing adults. And one thing that we hear from those hard of hearing adults is, I hate it when I say, "What did you say?" And my family says, "Never mind, it wasn't important." And we don't do that. We really try to be willing to repeat again and again. And that's critical, not just in terms of them developing grammar, but for their inclusion on a broader level within our family. So that willingness to repeat. Clear communication, again, is our priority. And we do have print around the house. Now, it's usually me that generates the print, and I need to do a better job of requiring that of them. But if we're going to have a topic, if we're going to have a plan, that idea, I'm going to also put it in writing for you so that you can go back and check it. And then tools for structure. That idea of I'm going to be able to write it down. And so, we've got a clipboard that's in the kitchen. We have whiteboards in our classroom. That idea of I can write it down at any minute. And my kid, you can type it. No, I'm not going to type it in your phone. I'm going to write it down. Captioning. The captioning should be on all the time. And so that, again, that's normal in our house for that captioning to be on. And that's important even as we go to other people's houses. One thing that we get asked sometimes is, so how old, because my kid can't read, right? She's 5. When do I start putting the captioning on? Today. You start putting the captioning on today. Because part of what you're modeling is self-advocacy and access. But we also know that exposure to print from early on is really helpful. And so that captioning we always want to have on. Remember also that captioning is not just on my TV. What about when we go to the movies? Our daughter, when she was in middle school, went with her deaf ed group to the movies, and Maggie was the only one who had ever gone to a movie and had captioning. All of the kids had been just watching movies without captioning. They didn't know how to ask for it at the movie theater, which is why the deaf ed teacher took them to the movie theater. But that idea of, do they know how to ask for captioning when they go to the movie? Captioning phones. Those are free devices. And so if your child could benefit from captioning on a phone, you can look into getting captioning on phone systems. And there are free state-funded captioning phone programs. Songs, rhymes, scripted stories. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to do this with our 20-year-old. But for our young children, songs and rhymes are great. And songs, singing to the deaf kids, yes. And And here's why, because those young children who are hard of hearing, it's a lot of work to organize language and organize speech and organize grammar. It's a lot of work. But when I sing the song, row, row, row your boat, I already know what it's going to say, right? He's going to go gently down the stream. I don't have to plan for that. And so because it's already scripted, I can actually practice the structure. And so those simple rhymes, those simple songs, you would do that with your hearing kid, but I want you to know that it can also really benefit your child who's hard of hearing or even deaf. Sentence level memory games. I'm going to say it, you're going to say it, and it sounds silly, but I put a link on that you can check out, and so it's that idea of I'm going to start something, and then you're going to repeat it, or you're going to add to my sentence. Story cards, what are those? Well, we use them in schools, and so you've got a series of pictures, and you put them in order, then you tell the story, right? And that helps you build the structure. Or wordless books, like I love Goodnight Gorilla, right? There's no print. Well, I think they say no at one point, but there's really no print in it. But you have to generate the story, which is a great opportunity for your kid. So we ran through a ton of strategies and tools really quickly. And so now what? Well, what we would say is make a summer plan, and it's not going to be perfect. But if you could identify within what we talked about a handful of strategies that might work for you, and then load up some of those tools, and that would be a great start. But also a reminder that life is not speech therapy, that you should enjoy your kid, you should give yourself a break, and recognize that you're going to make it work in your own way. And so there's our email. We're happy to share whatever. And I think my other tip would be it's never as good as it looks on Facebook, right? And so don't believe everybody else PR. Everybody's got a messy family just like yours. The end.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm trying to turn my camera on here. This is Teresa.
I see you.
Oh, there we go. I'm back. Thank you so much. That was so enlightening. And, so many of the things that you shared about your family and your strategies, I'm sure that probably each and every one of us here who have parented a deaf or hard of hearing child can pick up on one or two of those things. I know that in our house, we have that rule that we have to repeat what our daughter didn't hear, or what I didn't hear because I'm a hard of hearing adult, and now what my husband can't hear because he's also struggling with his hearing as well. And so we find ourselves repeating quite a lot. We do have a couple of questions, and let me go ahead and paraphrase these a little bit. So one is, have you experienced a kiddo who is not only deaf, hard of hearing, but also ADD, maybe has a short attention span, and any tips for that?
Yeah, we live with one of those. And one of the ways that we would describe that kid is deaf plus. And we would say that some of the issues with him are not as much of the language, but just that behavior regulation. And the reality is, the longer the day gets, the more difficult it is to maintain that. So, in terms of, how do I address language for that ADHD kid? I mean, part of it is by reducing those distractions. Part of it is by managing my expectations. Part of it, and so, shorter bursts. But a lot of it is I'm going to have to put language on top of active experiences. John is never going to sit down from the time he was 3 to now and read a storybook with me. That would be a great way to build language, not a match for him. But we can go outside and dig in the dirt and look for worms and do what, and so I'm going to have to think about different activities. And sometimes that feels like lowering your expectations, but sometimes it's meeting that kid where he is and giving both of you a little bit of grace.
Okay, thank you. And then one other question here is, any favorite graphic novel series that your kids enjoy? You have any tips or recommendations there? Or maybe a favorite or less complicated fiction book? But I see Bill's face lighting up, so.
He's trying to remember.
There's so many. A lot of our, I teach a lot of boys, so superheroes, and of course, there's And another kind of books that kids have enjoyed is a Diary Wimpy Kids.
Oh,
And
yeah.
there's the a girl version. I can't think of it now. There's another girl version of that diary type thing as well. And those cartoon drawings or pencil drawings in those books. But those type of books are very popular with our kids.
This is probably more than you need, but we like the book. I like the book El Defo. And it's the story of this bunny who has this old hearing aid, but it navigates a lot of the complexities of, the communication breakdown. And I'm not really a good signer. That's not going to work for me, but I have frustrating times with my hearing aid, and how do I navigate the social piece? And so, I know that some teachers have used that to talk through some of those issues, particularly related to self-advocacy. And the fact that it's a graphic novel makes it appealing. So that's called El Defo.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Well, we have come to the end of our webinar today. It is 1:01, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I want to take this moment to thank Sarah and Bill Wainscott for coming on with us today and sharing all about their families, highs and lows, more highs than lows, of course. And we want to thank our interpreters and captioners today as well. We have Hunter, our ASL interpreter, and Amber, our live captioner for today. We will hopefully share this webinar on our YouTube channel here in the next few days. But if anyone has any questions, for Sarah and Bill, would like to follow up on that, Sarah did post her email on the webinar, so be sure to take advantage of that. They are a wealth of knowledge, expert parents, and can definitely share some more insight if you have questions that you feel more comfortable asking them directly instead of live on our platform today. I also want to just remind everyone that you can find us not only on our website, www.txhv.org, but you can also find us on social media such as Facebook, Instagram, all sorts of platforms where you can search for us. Just do a Google search if you're not quite sure, you can't remember what we shared today. So thank you again for sharing your afternoon with us. Thank you again, Sarah and Bill. We appreciate you coming on. And we are at an end. So thank you so much, everyone, and y'all have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye. Thanks.